welcome to Watch You Want, and thanks for logging on. Well, it's Wednesday, and due to overwhelming demand, Wednesday is now the Watchmaker's Workshop. I'm here with Michael Michaels.
Pleasure to be here.
Lead watchmaker at Watch You Want and experienced in micro machining. We're going to talk about watchmaking beyond the simple overhauls today, beyond the disassembly, the cleaning, the lubrication, and the regulation, actually making pieces of the watch. And Mike, maybe you could explain to us a little bit the difference between cases and bracelets and refinishing and what you do.
We actually have on staff here, we actually have a professional refinisher, and he's trained at Richemont and various other brands as well. And when you hear refinishing, it's not just polishing and making the watch look pretty. We have so many watches come in that people try to sell to us, and they've just taken it, and if you look at some of the finishes on watches, we have everything from satin.
Sure. I'll be your hand model.
Okay, thank you. We have everything from satin finishes to high gloss and sharp edges, and the problem with refinishing a watch is you have to keep that integrity in the sharp edges, and you can't have bleed over and anything like that, and that's where it gets very, very critical, and you have to have a very skilled refinisher, and that's an art in itself, being able to make it look factory new, or as close to factory new as you can, because watches take a beating.
That's a fact. Mine especially. But now, as specialized and fine as that kind of micro metalwork is, we're getting orders of magnitude smaller today. We're going to talk about screws, we're going to talk about pivots, we're going to talk about wheels, fabricating parts and finishing parts for use in the movement, and that's where Mike comes in. I also want to mention, guys, that we are giving away swag tonight, and I'm going to be announcing our winners throughout the show. So you can't just watch the beginning and you can't fast forward to the end. I've got you for like 30 minutes tonight. So, Mike, let's talk about the basics. We have a picture of an exploded 2824, and this is the domain of the true watchmaker. It could be as simple as bending a balance cock for various functional reasons. This is the mounting for the balance. It's actually the cantilevered piece that holds it in place. Or as complex as cutting and staffing a wheel or balance.
Well, what you have is when you have a bent balance cock, actually you want the balance cock and the bridge to be parallel, completely parallel. But sometimes, depending on who worked on that watch last, an easier way to get end shake is to just move the balance cock up a little bit. We don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to flatten that balance cock back out again, make everything as parallel as possible, and actually move the jewels in the main plate. We'll move those jewels down just to get the optimum amount of end shake for those pivots to actually be able to breathe up and down. Without freedom, there can't be any motion. So we have a lot of times in watchmaking, what we have to do is undo the bad watchmaking that's happened, that some predecessor has tried to do. And a lot of times it's a quick fix that somebody tries to do. Let's get some more amplitude out of it, let's free things up. Yeah, that's not really the right approach. The right approach is to make everything the way it's supposed to be, and physically move the jewels.
So again, you might have to undo some bad watchmaking, and that starts with sometimes correcting a balance cock and removing deflection. Now in terms of perhaps the most important subject of the night, free stuff, I want to announce our first winner. Tonight's first winner is Simon Smollett. We understand you're off in the UK, but we're going to be shipping this to your sister's residence in the US, Simon. So it'll be waiting for you when you come, and what's waiting for you is a Panerai polo shirt that I brought back from SIHH. And in case you're wondering what that looks like, well, it looks roughly like this. So congratulations, Simon, and thanks for supporting us.
Thank you.
We've got some more cool stuff, guys, so stay tuned. We're going to talk about perhaps the defining subject in watchmaking, which is screws now with Mike. And also, I want to give a shout out to our live chat box and remind you that any questions you have for Mike get priority over our pre-programmed talking points. We love to go off topic, especially when it's on topic.
Absolutely.
Okay, so guys, screws. Mike?
Screws are one of the things that drive me crazy. You have so many different size screws, finishes of screws. If you're looking at something like a 2824, you have pretty much stamped screws. They're soft, they're not the high finish screws that we're normally dealing with on a higher finish movement like you see here. Those screws, if your screwdrivers are not sharpened right, and that's one of the things, and when you're going through certification, you learn the right way to fit screwdrivers into screws. You never want to bottom the screws out. We look for scratches at the bottom of the screws, little dog ears if you don't use the right diameter screwdriver. It's very easy to damage a screw. What we do as watchmakers, anytime we see that, we've got to get it out of there. We've got to replace it with a as new a screw as we can. 2824, any of the ETA products, screws are readily available. There's different finishes depending on how the screw or what the finish grade of the movement is. We have finely finished screws in a 2824, or we have rough screws. And same thing with the 2892 and the 7750. But the screw sizes are critical. You have different length screws. One of the things in this section of Cartier with the GP 3000 movement, and that actually has a very, very critical balance cock screw, where if you don't have the right screw in there, it actually holds the calendar up just by one extra thread on the length. It'll drive you crazy if you're not aware of this stuff. So screw lengths, screw diameters, screw finishes are just so critical when it comes to watchmaking, and making sure your screwdriver fits right so you don't damage the screws, and taking that extra time. All day when I'm working on a watch, I'm constantly altering, filing, sharpening, shortening, changing the diameter, or the width and the depth of my screwdrivers, just how they fit screws. It's something I do all day. And then you go one step further, taking with a Geneva or Fleurier seal, and actually the point of the screw you don't even see is finished. That's actually polished as well, and it's buried inside the movement, but it's still finished. And you have to be extra critical about that, because you have to treat that watch, every last screw of that watch. It's funny, I called it a complication one time. Where every screw on a Geneva seal watch is a complication, just because of the delicacy that you have to treat it. You have to treat it with so much respect. One false move and you could scratch a screw, and that's not acceptable.
And that's true. I mean, screws, you want to say in the highest echelons of watchmaking, they can be like the 25 Swiss franc screw at the likes of Chopard or Vacheron Constantin. You could go all the way up to the €100 screw at Lang & Heine. So you're looking at screws being not just ubiquitous and important for assembly, but individually sensitive regarding how they're created and then how they're finished. And now, Mike, you can, when you don't have the part, create a screw, and I think that's where we talk about the lathe and its role in watchmaking.
I love lathe work. I love micromechanics and lathe work, and I come from a background. I was a machinist before. I did a lot of wood turning before. So when I transitioned into watchmaking, it was actually very easy for me, and I was always been very, very comfortable on the lathe. One of the things I enjoy doing most are making screws. And it's some of the movements that we work on, whether it's a pusher screw or a movement screw, to a bracelet screw. A lot of times we'll have to fabricate that screw from scratch, whether it be from gold, stainless steel, or steel. And when we fabricate a screw, the one thing that I demand in the shop is you can't be able to tell it apart from the rest of the screws in the movement. You should be able to take that screw out, put it anyplace else, take that screw out, put it anyplace else, and not be able to tell which was which. And that's one of the things. I want the bottom of the screws finished, I want the top finished, I want the bevels, I want the cut, everything to look like it's a factory screw, and it takes time to do it. It takes time and skill.
Now, before we launch into a little discussion of proposed testing standards that you've discussed, and Mike has strong feelings about how watchmakers in the U.S. should be educated. He's a traditionalist. I do want to give a quick shout out to our audience. Some of the questions coming through. Jason Whitehurst is asking, can we refinish his Rolex Deep Sea bracelet? Yes. Yeah. Also, questions coming in. Should you have the seals changed on a dive watch between services, or just wait till a full service? This is from Scott Hockenberry.
If you use your dive watch, it's actually a good idea to have it serviced. And I would just roughly go on every 2 years, because it's going to be half the time you're getting the movement service, and that's really the only way you're going to be able to tell if that watch is going to meet ISO specifications. And if you're diving, you're relying on that watch to actually tell you how long you've been under, as a backup. And one thing you don't want is to have any kind of water intrusion. The first seal we see go is the crystal gasket, because that's the one that's affected by ultraviolet light the most.
Yeah, now it's also important to note, just with respect to water resistance, it's good to have a full diagnostic done when you take your watch in for a water resistance test. Have its cosmetic condition inspected, have its mechanical integrity inspected. And this is a great periodic checkup. For those of you who are asking how long before I have to service my watch, it's not a fixed number, so having regular checkups, just like with the human body, is better than waiting for a disaster. And again, that 1 to 2 year interval is a good number. just for a checkup. Question from Jesse, 747-400. Is there really a difference other than decoration between an ETA movement on brands using these that are offered under 1,000 and more expensive brands which use the same movements? I just want to clarify that ETA no longer delivers unfinished calibers or parts of calibers in many instances. You have to buy the whole movement, in which case you have a choice of 4 grades. You have base, elaboré, top, and chronometer. So yes, big differences in hairspring, drivetrain, power source, balance wheel. So yes, very big differences. When you're buying like an Omega chronometer grade ETA 2892, you're getting something very different than when you get a base 2892 that's just ticking over and winding itself.
I have seen some on the earlier ones when houses were refinishing the movements or finishing the movements. I've seen some absolutely stunning 2892s. I think it was the prettiest one I ever saw was in a Pierre Kunz. And it was, I remember showing you that one. It was absolutely a stunning finish on a regular 2892. Just it was a very, very attractive watch though. The screws, everything about the watch was finished really nicely inside.
And that's the other X factor. In addition to those 4 different levels of elaboration that you can get from ETA, there's also what the brands will do in-house. Everyone remembers the Destriero Scafusia from the early 1990s, which was possibly the ultimate iteration of a 7750 taken to the level of high art, aesthetically and mechanically. You can do almost anything with a movement. Once you get it now in one piece from ETA, you can still do crazy things to remanufacture parts and decorate it. So yes, there are those basic differences you can get from the factory, and then there's a world of elaboration ready to be performed by the brand that cases and finishes the movement.
One thing I like to add with that too, if you end up with a base movement, a base 2892 with just a regular sandblast movement, nothing fancy, a skilled watchmaker can still turn that in their chronometer specifications. And that's actually part of our test where we have to turn a non-chronometer movement, basically get chronometer numbers out of it.
And this is a good segue into what we were talking about with respect to finishing standards for creating screws and being graded on them. I think you once told me that you had something along the lines of a 1 to 5 scale for the grading of a screw, and during the CW21 exam.
Yeah, it was one of the things we had talked about from micromechanics. There's different avenues we went into. And part of the debate was, was it feasible to have a screw as part of the test, actually manufacturing a screw? And one of my ideas that I supported was actually manufacturing a bracelet screw and a bridge screw. And the way it'd be graded is, number one, does it function as a screw? If it at least functions as a screw, you get 1 point for it. Then you start comparing it. If you could take it out and put it anyplace else, move it in the movement, is a screw indistinguishable from factory? Of course, that would be the highest grade. And that's where, at some point I would love to see that, because that's one of the things that I like to do when I bench test people. I want to see, people say they can work on a lathe. I want to see them make a screw.
Yeah, exactly. Making a screw, again, so much more complicated than just getting the pitch of the threading correct. Now, we take it to the next level here. We're talking about balance staffs, and I pick balance staffs because it's something I can reference from some experience. I was in a watchmaking class way over my head. I'm like, okay, let's just get the overhaul done. Other people are cutting out balance staffs, fabricating. So we had all sorts of levels of expertise or inexpertise there. But explain what a balance staff is and why it's distinct from the balance wheel itself.
Well, you have an image you're pulling up, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay. The balance staff itself is actually what the balance rides on. It supports the balance. It controls the actual position in the watch of the balance, because the position is critical, because you have different parts interacting. You have the roller jewel that is interacting with the lever or the pallet. And that is very critical as far as your positioning. Everything, the roller jewel, everything has to be perfect, otherwise you end up in overbanking positions. Again, very, very critical. I actually, years ago, I used to make balance staffs, and for a lot of pocket watches, and not just put them in. I actually had to fabricate stuff for a lot of vintage stuff. And sometimes I would start with no sample at all. So I'd have to actually replace jewels that were cracked, replace a jewel, fabricate a balance staff, and start from there. And I used to really enjoy it, and that's what we're looking at right there.
Now, in terms of the geography of the balance staff, it may look simple. It may look like
You've got a
little,
lot of cuts.
yeah, it may look like a thumbtack, but there are probably 11 specific surfaces and functional areas of the balance staff that a watchmaker could identify, and all of them have to be executed properly. And this is where your basic ETA Unitas 6497 becomes really, really complex. Yeah, maybe there's only 100 parts kicking around in there, but when the parts are like this, details count.
Exactly. And we have there's many measurements there too. Besides, you have the pivots, you have the overall length, you have the roller table, you have the balance where the rivet is, and where the hairspring is, the taper for the hairspring. So you have a lot of different angles there. That it's extremely critical, down to thousands of millimeters difference.
Now, I also want to emphasize, because we have a graphic of staff in balance, just to show how this is fitted. If you want a visual of how this actually fits into the balance wheel and interacts with the capstones holding it in place, we have a graphic that Faylene has color-coded, no less, because I like things that are simple. So you can actually see, now we're talking about something that's probably smaller than, what's
probably a diameter of a grain of rice.
Yeah,
turn a grain of rice on the side. So we're talking small.
Yeah, so I was going to say a dime, but I realize our international viewers don't know how big a U.S. dime is. The whole balance is smaller than a dime, and the balance staff is like a grain of rice, a micro-machined
break the grain of rice in half and then split it in half again, and then that's where you're at for a balance staff.
So now in terms of staffing, first you have to remove a broken balance staff.
You have to remove the broken balance staff, and there's different ways to do it. Rolex actually has a toolkit that's done with the Horia. It actually presses it out without any damage to the balance wheel itself. The preferred method and the traditional way is to actually cut the rivet off in a lathe with a graver, and it's that you actually cut the rivet. The rivet is actually bent out over the balance wheel. It's bent out. You cut that off, and then the staff itself will just press right out. And that, theoretically, you don't touch the balance whatsoever.
Faylene, we have a balance staff extraction diagram just to show how this is actually done. Now, once again, the lathe comes into play. You can see the graver, the chuck, the wheel, and the staff.
Yeah, when you do this right, you end up with a nice little ring that rides right up on with the remainder of the balance staff itself. And after you do that, you can take the balance and pretty much just press the balance right out. And again, the whole thing is you don't want to bend the balance arms in any way, shape, or form, because then you just made a lot of work for yourself.
Exactly, and then of course, in the end, when you're fitting the staff, we have an image of fitting the staff too, you have to then create a rivet by applying pressure.
Yeah, the rivets actually, you have a straight wall, and you're actually going to make a rivet. And the rivet is going to just kind of compress back up over the balance arm. You don't want to over-rivet it, because again, if you deform those arms on the balance, then you just made a lot of work for yourself, because that balance has to run perfectly true and perfectly flat. And that's probably something we could show in a later episode.
Now, in
actually
terms
do a
of
whole staff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's going to be a time-lapse thing. How long would you say it takes from start to finish, removing an old staff, creating on a lathe, and fitting?
Creating is a whole different story. But staffs are readily available for any modern movement that's being made right now. It's the antiques that you have to modify or make a staff from scratch for.
Now, Faylene, we actually have a pivot polishing rig that Mike has upstairs, and I would love to show our audience what this looks like, and it's so archaic in the way it works. Once we have the graphic up, I'm going to ask Mike to describe exactly how this little, I swear it has more in common with how like Aboriginal folks would create fires in many cultures.
Pretty much.
Explain how this works, Mike.
This is the J-Cot tool, and this is a tool that I've used a lot. I still use a lot for polishing pivots. Actually, what we're going to demonstrate in here is, she has a video, right?
We're loading up the video for next week. Next week's Wednesday Watchmakers Workshop.
Yeah, it's a J-Cot tool. Again, it's made for actually turning the pivots to the proper dimension. And there's different parts on it, and there's slots where actually the pivot will actually sit into a slot, and you can file the pivot down or polish the pivot down to a very, very precise degree. Again, I've used this a lot, especially in antique watches, pocket watch restorations, where you get a balance staff and things aren't made to the same tolerance, or tolerances change, and put it in, and it's a lot of fun to use. A quick story about the J-Cot tool. When I was in Fleurier at the Chopard School, they were instructing on the J-Cot tool, and they had all the students playing with it. and are trying to operate it. And the instructor looked and he asked us, we were all in the course taking the exam, and the instructor asked, he said, does anybody want to try? Well, the other two people sat down. One was from Hong Kong, one was from China. They both sat down and the wheels flew out of it as soon as they started it. And he looked at me and he said, do you want to try? And I said, no, I have one at home. And of course, he didn't believe me, so I sat down, and being left-handed, I switched everything around, and I went in there and I started filing down and powering it by hand and doing everything I had to do, and I looked over and everybody was standing with their iPhones watching.
The part that's missing from this whole discussion, and which gets back to what I was saying at the beginning about how it's almost like building a fire, it has a bow, with a string.
It has a little string bow.
And you literally saw the bow back and forth to power the device and provide, the rotational energy.
Yeah, it's one of the more enjoyable tools to use, and what I like about it is the tool just looks beautiful as well. It just makes it that much more fun.
So we have some questions coming through that I definitely want to honor, because some of these are good questions, and they're definitely on topic for tonight's theme. But Mike, what do you think is the most difficult, or inherently more difficult, or inherently easier complication to work on?
A perpetual calendar has to be one of the harder complications to work on. You have so much to set up. You have to get everything from your surprise piece, depending on how it's configured. A lot of brands use a surprise piece, which actually they call it a surprise piece. That's what comes out in leap year to add one more day to your calendar. The Patek 240D is one model that doesn't. It actually has a 24-hour or 48-month wheel with one more day cut deeper. So perpetuals, the hardest thing about perpetual is setting it back up. And you have to have everything aligned correctly, and then have your days, have everything, especially on one that does not have independent correctors, such as the IWC and the JLC.
Yeah, that's a good point. The IWC Kurt Claus perpetual calendar module, it's all or nothing. If it's out of sequence, it has to come apart again, because you can't individually correct the indications. Also, I had a question from Jason Whitehurst asking what was in his Carl F. Bucher Scuba Tech when we had our discussion of movement grades. I believe it's chronometer grade 2892A2, highest grade. Also, wanted to possibly suggest that maybe a chronograph like the 2894, because of the way the module is built.
The 2894 really isn't a difficult chronograph as long as you have the tool to put it together. It has less parts. I did one last week, and we don't do a lot of them here. They just don't need service that often. We're one of the few places that actually do the service on them. But the 2894, if you don't have the direct holder for it that holds all the springs back, you're never going to get it back together again. And so I would advise, don't even try taking it apart unless you have the holder, unless you have the training to actually take on something like that, because it really doesn't follow much sense. If you think it's like a 7750, you'll look at it and you don't understand how it works. It's a bunch of levers and springs, and it just moves things up and down. And the starting and stopping is just the vertical clutches. It has 3 vertical clutches inside of it.
Yes, 3 vertical clutches. So when you have one of these things done, before you take the plunge, ask, do they have the tools? Are they a Swatch service center? It's the kind of thing where you have to have the tools, the training, and the parts, and they all come together.
Exactly.
And we do. So I'm happy to say that. Question coming from Nana Odoro asking, what do I think of the IWC Pilot Heritage 48 as a first watch? This came out last year in a series of 1,000 pieces. I would say, honestly, knowing nothing about your wrist size, try before you buy. Yeah, it's not the bigger of the two. They did have a 55 and 100 pieces, but that's just plain bonkers. That's a novelty watch. The 48 you might be able to wear, but you'll only know if you try it on. Also, question coming in from C.S. Ramirez asking me, Tim, what were my 3 favorites from JLC during SIHH? I'm going to be real quick with these because I don't want to take time out of our watchmaking discussion too much, but I loved the Ibris Artistica Mysterious. I loved the new Reverso Tribute Duo in rose gold with grained dial, very nice. And I also thought that the new Master Geographic was very well done. Not all of the new sector dials look right, but that one has just enough heritage inflection with JLC's modern world time signature complication that I really think it's a winner. There are a few pieces that I saw that haven't been announced yet, which I liked, so I can't tell you, but there's good stuff to come from JLC later in the year. The story continues. Okay, Mike. So I'm also going to announce one of our winners, and by that I mean our second. Our second winner of the night is Benton Kalani. Benton, congratulations! You have won this sweet Alanga Unzuna press kit and notebook. The notebook is gorgeous. The press kit is fun. It's a USB and a catalog. And for fun, I also threw in a Chinese language catalog they gave me, just because I love that kind of global flair that you encounter at SIHH. They have press from all over the world there, so you get a little bit of an extra. That's coming to you. And jumping back to our topic of the night, we are going to talk a little bit about dial feet, because Mike, I know you had a project of your own that involved exactly this. Tell our friends what dial feet are and how you work on them.
Dial feet, when you have the main plate of the movement, the dial has to be attached in some way, shape, or form so it doesn't spin around, because you have a hole in the center of it, or if you have a chronograph, you have other holes for the pinions that come through. But you have basically a disc with a hole in the center. If you didn't have it attached in some way, it would just spin. And we'll see watches come in for service where the date window's off. And the reason the date window's off is dial feet are broken, the dial actually shifted inside the case. It's not uncommon, it just takes the right kind of shock. More watches are susceptible to it than others, just by construction. If they use the dial to actually anchor the movement, then it's more susceptible to a shock, is going to shear the dial feet off. What dial feet are, though, they're two pins that come out of the bottom of the dial that actually plug into the movement. They're either attached with levers. For ETA 7750 has a lever, or they have a cam system. Some are frictioned in. Some Frederick Piguets are actually frictioned in, where it presses into a nylon little clamp. And basically the dial feet just hold it in. They do break, though. And as Tim just mentioned, I started a little project of my own and made a dial out of Spanish doubloon. And I had to actually solder on dial feet, and it's getting them in the right position and put them in, because you have to be able to remove the watch and put it back on again, because the dial is not a permanent attachment to the movement.
Yeah, and you can see the first photo we had on the screen, basically dial feet floating around, and you can see how big they are and how they're shaped. And now you can see how they're soldered onto the back side of a dial, and they actually anchor the dial into the movement. The feet go down, screws generally come in laterally and pin it in place. And
they do bend too. The feet actually bend too, and sometimes we could shift them back. You'll see them that have a little jog in them, where the dial feet will come up and they'll just have a little bend in it. A lot of times we could straighten those out, but if you're not careful, they'll shear right off.
And it's also important to be very careful, because so many vintage watches require dial removal to authenticate. You know, let's say you've got a Paul Newman Daytona from the 1960s, and you want to make sure that it's signed Singer on the back, and you know that the maker's marks are correct. You're going to be dealing with a very delicate process of taking that dial out of the movement.
Exactly. That you have a bigger issue with that watch too, is the hands, because the hands are painted, and as soon as you go to try to leather those hands off, the paint can actually flake off. So that's one of the more delicate tasks we have to do sometimes.
Could you talk a little bit about soldering in general as a watchmaker and the role it plays beyond dial feet?
Soldering isn't used too much. The only time we'll use soldering is we'll use silver soldering, because obviously higher temperature, it's a strong solder. We don't use a low temperature lead solder. It just doesn't have the strength to hold together. Other things we do, though, we do laser welding as well, and that laser welding can be used to build a case back up if metal's gone. It can be used in some watchmaking aspects to reattach springs to levers. We've used it a few different ways successfully. We've used it other ways not successfully that we've tried. Laser welding is still in its infancy as far as micromechanics. You still have to do some machining down. It's a lot of fun, but it also I think the prospects going further are going to be great.
And that's something we're working on here. Laser welding is coming to Watch You Want. You can write that down.
Yeah, absolutely.
But before we do, wrist check, Mike. Show us what you got.
Where are we at?
Okay. Let me zoom out a little bit. And Mike is wearing the real deal. Seamaster 600, Ploprof, 1970s, on a gorgeous, is that Stingray?
That is Stingray.
There's a Stingray scale strap. You don't see that too often, but it's a beautiful match for the blue dial. That's probably the sharpest thing anyone's wearing today at Watch You Want. Where'd you get that strap, by the way?
Tim, I don't even remember.
And this is what I'm wearing.
Stingray.
Yeah, this is a calf, or it was. At some point, this was a cow, and it's attached to what remains a jaeger-lecoultre Amvox 2 chronograph. This is the original 2006 model in titanium, 44 millimeter, made in a series of 750 pieces. I'm wearing it because I am a motorsports fan, and this is one of the best auto co-branded watches.
Absolutely.
The 24 Hours of Daytona is this weekend, guys. I will be watching, and if I can, I will be watching the whole thing. But all the same, motorsports, very cool. Watches, very cool. Somehow they always wind up intertwined. And that's also why I have a actual Rolex Daytona, where you can see this is the classical gift for the winners in each class. And endurance racing, remember folks, is a team sport, so 3 to 4 per car. And when you win Daytona as a driver of any class, you get that watch. I also want to answer a question regarding this funky little thing, the little Royal Oak looking thing. One of you mentioned that we have a watch that looks like a Royal Oak but isn't quite. Well, it is technically a Royal Oak. This type of Royal Oak was built from 1977 to 1985. If you search Royal Oak 6005 online, you will find that watch. It is quartz powered, so it's a little bit different from the standard fare. It's a different look. It's very rare. I would say you see one of those for every 100, maybe 200 conventional Royal Oaks. So in any case, tonight we've got some fantastic watches on the table. We've got some fantastic questions in the chat box. A question coming from Peter Cervelli, which is, what is regulation and can every watch be regulated? Mike?
Yes. Yeah, to a point, every watch can be regulated. What we look at is how close a regulation can we get. When we start looking at vintage stuff that's been worked on time and time again, so much metal's been removed, it becomes very difficult to get a clean regulation or a close delta. Delta is our split from our fastest to slowest rate in positions. We actually test the watches. We're going to test a watch in a dial up position, and a dial down position, and crown down position, 9 o'clock position, and 12 o'clock position. So we're gonna test the watch in different positions, and then take that average. Take the average of what the different watches are, and what the different numbers are, and we want those numbers basically less than 8 seconds from the fastest to slowest. And the closest we can get, chasing that unicorn, the closest we can get, we're gonna get. Can they be adjusted? Yes. Can watches be regulated? Yes. If you have balance screws, they actually have on the antiques timing screws, which I used to love using. Timing screws, I'll have to bring those in sometime and show you because they're one of the most fun things to use. You would actually take timing screws out of the balance and install washers. And these washers were gauged for the size of the balance, the size of the movement, and they were either be a half a minute, 1 minute, 2 minutes. And they work. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. You put them in pairs, and the watch worked. As far as new watches, free sprung balances, they're timed inertially with either microstello screws. If it's the case of Rolex, they actually have a microstello bolt if it's an Omega. And also Blancpain uses that as well. IWC is using it. So a lot more companies are going to the free sprung balance, which does not have a regulator. It relies on the actual mass and inertia of the balance itself to time it and regulate it.
There's a lot that goes into regulation. It could be anything from just moving a regulating organ, like turning an Edachron screw. You could move a mobile index. You can do things like change lubricants, add more end shake, subtract end shake, but then you can also remove material from the balance during dynamic poising.
Either add material or remove material. Actually, if you look on my Instagram, I just posted a picture yesterday of a final regulation of a Blancpain.
Yeah, and speaking of Blancpain, we have a question from the field. This is a question regarding, now you're very familiar with the Breitling B01 caliber.
Somewhat, not very, somewhat.
Mike worked Breitling factory service, and we've seen B01s here. The thing is, when they come in under warranty and they have issues, we prefer to just make them Breitling's problem.
Yeah.
But we did have a question regarding whether the Blancpain F385 is preferable to the Breitling B01. Now, the F385 is Blancpain's in-house automatic 36,000 vibration per hour, so El Primero style chronograph, and it's a flyback in its standard form. It also has about a 50-hour power reserve like the El Primero, and of course, being high-end Swatch Group, it also has a silicon balance spring, so it's amagnetic. Mike, I don't know how much experience you have with that specific movement, but if it's as strong as the 1315 or the 13RO, what would you say comparing the two?
I'm a fan of the Frederic Piguet-based movements, the Blancpain movements. I'm a big fan of those. The Breitling, one of the things Breitling was made for, it was made to be serviceable, where you can take off basically the chronograph bridge without removing the wheels. Everything comes apart. The movement is very serviceable. It did have some issues when it first came out as far as power reserve. And they're getting those fixed, and that's why if we have one of those watches come in, if it's under warranty, we send it in, because then it's going to come back with the most upgraded version of the movement. And that happens with a lot of different brands. Anytime they introduce, we mentioned this before in other segments, anytime brands introduce a new model, it's like a new model car. They don't necessarily do recalls on it, but they do a case study of watches they see come back, and they start a history and trends. They follow trends, and they find out what's wrong with the movements, and they go to fix them. So the first year or two of a movement isn't always the best movement to have, but as long as they upgrade that movement for you, then you're a lot better off. One of the things you can tell too is when you start looking at brands, look at the warranty. How like the Omega 8500, how the warranty now is 5 years. So that tells you they got the bugs worked out of it.
And it is important to note that there's always a learning curve, but while we saw a significant learning curve with the BO1, and maybe that's just because they made so many of them, we haven't really heard about any problems with the more robust sports watch intended Blancpain calibers, the 13RO, the 1315, and the F385. I haven't heard any horror stories, and rest assured you would still hear them even though Blancpains are low volume, because many people complained that the 1185s were appropriated as sports watch calibers in the Le Mans and the 50 Fathoms line. We heard complaints about those. We have not heard any issues with the F385 in its 2 years plus now on the market. I also want to acknowledge Alex, who is mentioning, by the way, this is the first year the winner of the 24 Hours of Daytona will get the ceramic bezel Daytona. That's right. That debuted at Baselworld last year, so it was steel bezel for last year.
Very
it's
nice.
going to be ceramic this year. So if you ever wanted to flip a Daytona-winning Rolex, this is probably the perfect storm. Okay, so now other questions coming through. Could you talk a little bit about the complication involved, not in the reverso movements, but in the case itself? This is coming from D-Lamp.
The reverso. Tim knows I've done quite a few of those.
Yes.
and what's difficult in the reverso is the amount of screws and the order of assembly. Just to get the actual movement, or the case, the container, off the bracelet takes 4 screws just to be able to get to it. Then just to get the case open, and then you actually, a lot of the reversos, because the reverso you have dual dials. So you have to remove the one dial to actually get to the movement, to remove the movement out of the case. And they can be a nightmare to work on. They can be a nightmare to water test. They can be a nightmare to get to reseal again. A lot of the crystals are cemented in. They use a special cement as well, and one of the things when we polish them, we don't want to leave them in the ultrasonic too long. We break that cement loose. They're difficult. They're very challenging watches. They're beautiful watches. They're one of my favorites. I know they're one of your favorites as well. They challenge us though, especially the chronographs. You have the pushers and everything else, just to get them to reseal, because it's not a normal case construction.
Yeah, it's important to note that your average reverso is going to have between 50 and 70 parts in the case alone, and that's not including the cement that Mike mentioned. Plus, by definition, you're going to have a non-round crystal. The toughest challenge to make watertight. Also important to note that you're dealing with so many seams and seals and specialized parts that really have no analog in any other type of watch. It's a very bespoke type of case assembly. I personally consider no reverso of the traditional case design to be water resistant. Squadras and maybe Grand Sports that have been recently serviced, but I consider traditional 3 ATM reversos to not be water resistant watches, and that's how I wear mine. We do have an interesting question coming through. Okay, so crystals cemented in, Kiki Fries thinks this sounds like a yikes type of situation. It's actually pretty common with non-round crystals.
It's very common, even round crystals. A lot of manufacturers cement them in. Patek on some models, they cement crystals in. Roger Dubuis cements crystals in. It's very, very common. We use an ultraviolet cement, a 2-part cement depending on the model. And therefore, the longer you're wearing the watch, the longer it's out, it's a light cure cement. Once the cement is cured, it's water clear, and you don't even know it's there. And the difference is you don't have that gap where there's a gasket holding the crystal in. That's the difference in it. Would that be a waterproof watch? No, they're not waterproof. They're water resistant because it doesn't have the same compression that a gasketed watch would. The gasket, when you press the gasket in for a pressed-in crystal, it actually compresses that gasket, and that in turn holds that crystal. So Rolex is a whole different story.
Yeah, cement crystals in general, they're looking to survive a splash, not go wholehearted into the water, regardless of what's said. A cemented crystal is generally your sign that you need to take care as an owner. Now, Philip Allen joining us live for the first time from Essex, England. Philip, thanks for staying up with me. I really appreciate that. I also want to speak to Jeremiah's question regarding the new ceramic Royal Oak, ceramic bracelets in general. So if you're talking about something like a Tutanero Panerai 438, or you're talking about the new Royal Oak 26579 full ceramic bracelet, I would say AP is being bold because it is not a material that lends itself well to impact. Yes, it's scratch resistant, but there's a sliding scale between scratch resistance and resistance to shatter. And unfortunately, the more scratch resistant you become, the more brittle the material. I have inspected,
That's what scares me right there.
Yeah, Mike is showing a gold Royal Oak bracelet.
And where you have a twist like that is where it scares me as far as ceramic in a bracelet.
And it's important to note, and Faylene, we'll go back to that macro shot, the ceramic bracelet is built the same way as this traditional Royal Oak precious metal bracelet. I've seen it, I've handled it, and my concern is the intersection of the plots that join the links together and the links themselves. That's pretty close to a 90-degree angle, and wherever I see a sharp split like that, I think stress riser. Add the fact that these are really small parts, and I can easily see that coming back to haunt Audemars Piguet, because this is an $85,000 watch, this new ceramic perpetual calendar. And I'll also mention, because it hasn't been widely covered, that this year's SIHH also saw the debut of the first full ceramic Royal Oak offshores, bezel and case, not bracelet, they're still on rubber straps. But I would not be an early adopter of this particular technology. I think it's ill-suited. How do you feel, Mike?
I feel the exact same way. Ceramic, it's a great product. Because it doesn't scratch. When you see a scratch on ceramic, 9 times out of 10, it's the product or whatever material that the bracelet or case scratched or bumped up against and was scratched and left a deposit on the ceramic. That can be removed. That's one of the fun things about ceramic. We saw this when I was working at Hugo for years, where they use a lot of ceramics, and we can clean that off. The downside of ceramic is because it's so hard, the trade-off is it's very, very brittle. It breaks like glass. You drop it, they shatter. There's your trade-off.
And I think we've seen the biggest problems with ceramic on Panerai cases because Panerai, by definition, tends to feature some sort of very distinct lug structure. Blended lug Panerai watches are not common. You've got the Mare Nostrum where they exist infrequently, and then you've got pretty much everything else. Especially in the Radiomir 1940 case or any Luminor case where you have that lug projecting out and it fits to the case at more or less a right angle. We've seen a lot of cracks and breaks, and that's a multi-$1,000 replacement. Now you add the AP factor where the whole bracelet is not just ceramic but hand finished. Serious coin. Again, I wouldn't want to be an early adopter. However, you don't have to be an early adopter to win free stuff from SIHH, and I want to give a shout out to our final 2 winners of the night. Brian Duffy, congratulations. Thanks for submitting your name. You have won, Brian Duffy has won the Baume & Mercier Clifton tote bag, actually. This is a bag within a bag, and it's a tribute to the new Clifton collection featuring the same signal orange cues that you see here. Definitely worth a look. And I want to give a shout out to Rob Krasnick, who's won this super cool Mont Blanc deluxe notebook. It actually features silvered pages on the flank, so it almost looks like a solid block of silver when you close it and look at it from the flank. Really nice stuff. That's the kind of thing you can get in a Mont Blanc boutique, and I don't mean a watchmaking boutique. That's from the leather goods selection, so you're going to like this. And much more to come. I have so much stuff I couldn't give it away in just one episode, but I definitely want to thank everyone who joined us, tackle one final question, and then give my salutations, or I should say my valedictory, to everyone who's watching, and my producer, Faylene Jerome, who keeps me on topic and on time. So, questions. What do we think of Zeniths with ceramized aluminum? What do we think of the whole Cermet concept? Aluminum inside, ceramized on the outside.
I don't know yet. That's the only answer. Is I don't know yet. I don't know how it's going to wear. You have dissimilar metals. You have similar expansions and contractions. Aluminum expands and contracts so much with heat and temperature. So I don't know how it's going to wear yet.
It's something we've seen across the industry, and it's worth mentioning that in the bathyscaphe family, Swatch Group actually gave up on ceramized coating early on. I think fewer than 100 of those were made for the original bathyscaphe that debuted back in 2013. So it's not necessarily easy to do, and it's still a bit of a science project. On paper, it's not shatter susceptible because the aluminum core remains, and on the outside, the ceramized, they call it Cermet at jaeger-lecoultre, they call it composite at Panerai, they call it ceramized aluminum at Zenith. It's all the same stuff. It should combine the best of metal and ceramic in theory, or like Mike says, you've got dissimilar materials that expand and contract at different rates. If the Swatch experience with Blancpain is instructive, that could be a problem. Again, I would say don't necessarily be an early adopter if you have to get in deep on price. And probably don't make that your only watch either, because sooner or later something will get through the coating and then it can't be refinished.
Exactly.
Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back on Friday. I want to give a shout out to Faylene. I want to thank Mike for joining me.
Thank you, Tim.
Next week, Mike will be back, so start fielding your questions. Tim at watchyouwant.com. Of course, you can see Mike Michaels on Instagram. Mike, what's your handle?
Michael R. Michaels.
On Instagram. You want to see teardowns and build-ups of the best stuff? He's got it. Thank you so much. This is Watch You Want, and thanks for logging on.
Thank you.